Dr. Julia Whittaker had always prided herself on her ability to remain professional in the face of any challenge. As one of the senior surgeons at St. Lawrence General, she was accustomed to high-stress situations, long hours, and the occasional emotional toll that came with the job. But today, as she walked through the sterile white halls of the hospital, a knot twisted in her stomach. Something was different. It had started with the arrival of Dr. Samuel Wright. He was a recent addition to the surgical team, a well-established heart surgeon with a reputation that preceded him. His credentials were impeccable, his hands steady, and his ability to make the most difficult surgeries seem effortless was nothing short of extraordinary. But it wasn't his skill that had caught Julia's attention, it was the way he looked at her. Their first encounter had been nothing more than a fleeting moment, a brief exchange in the OR. But from the moment their eyes met, Julia felt an inexplicable pull. He had a way of making her feel seen, heard, in a way no one else did. And it frightened her. She had always been focused on her career, driven by ambition and the desire to be the best. She had worked hard to earn her position at the hospital, and relationships, especially those with colleagues, had never been a priority. But Samuel was different. There was something in the way he carried himself, confident yet kind, aloof yet attentive. And as much as she hated to admit it, it had begun to affect her. Today was no different. Julia had just finished a particularly challenging surgery, and as she walked down the corridor to grab a coffee, she spotted Samuel at the nurse's station. He was talking with one of the junior doctors, laughing about something she couldn't hear, but it was the way he smiled, the way his eyes sparkled, that made her heart skip a beat. He glanced up and caught her gaze. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and Julia felt a flutter in her chest. She quickly looked away, focusing on the coffee machine in front of her. Her mind raced as she tried to push the thoughts of him out of her head. This was ridiculous. She was a professional. She had no time for distractions, especially not with someone like Samuel. But as she poured her coffee, she felt a presence behind her. She knew it was him before he even spoke. Dr. Whittaker, Samuel's voice was smooth, warm, and too close. You know, you're more talented than half the surgeons in this hospital. I'm just trying to learn from the best. Julia turned, surprised by the compliment. You're too kind, Dr. Wright, she replied, forcing a smile. We all have our strengths. I'm serious, he said, his gaze lingering on her a bit longer than necessary. I've seen you in action. You don't just save lives, you change them. Julia felt a heat rise in her cheeks. She was used to compliments, but something about the way Samuel spoke to her made her feel exposed, vulnerable. She quickly took a sip of her coffee to mask the awkwardness that was beginning to take root. Well, thank you. I appreciate the sentiment, but you're not so bad yourself, Julia said, trying to keep the conversation light, even though she could feel the weight of his attention. Samuel smiled, a slow, almost teasing grin. Maybe we should grab dinner sometime, talk shop, or talk about something else entirely. Julia's stomach did a flip. It was a casual invitation, but there was an edge to it. She could see the way he was looking at her, the subtle way his eyes traced her features, and it made her heart race. I don't think that's appropriate, she said quickly, her professional walls going up. We work together, Samuel. We should keep it that way. The smile faded from his face for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Of course, he said, his voice smooth. I respect that. I'm just saying, sometimes a little outside the hospital could be refreshing. Julia's pulse quickened. She knew she should walk away, that this conversation wasn't leading anywhere good, but for some reason, she found herself rooted to the spot. Before she could respond, a nurse came running down the hallway, a look of urgency on her face. Dr. Whittaker, Dr. Wright, we need you in the ER. There's been a multiple vehicle accident. They're bringing in a lot of trauma cases. Julia's instinct took over. Let's go, she said, her voice already in command. "We'll handle it together." Samuel nodded, his expression shifting back to one of focus. "Lead the way." As they walked toward the ER, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that the brief moment they had shared was only the beginning of something she wasn't ready to face. But she was a doctor, and there was work to be done. There always was. The ER was chaos. Nurses and doctors darted from one patient to another, shouting orders, taking vitals, and performing life-saving procedures. The air was thick with tension, and the scent of antiseptic seemed to permeate every corner. Julia was in her element, focused and determined. She moved swiftly, directing her team as she assessed the incoming patients. Samuel was by her side, a steady presence, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the frenzy around them. "Trauma 1, follow me," Julia shouted, motioning to a team of nurses as she guided a stretcher into one of the treatment rooms. A young man, no older than 20, had been brought in with multiple fractures and internal bleeding after a horrific car crash. Julia's mind went into overdrive as she began to assess the situation. "Dr. Wright, I need you to stabilize his airway," Julia instructed, her voice clear and firm. "I'll prep for surgery." Samuel nodded, immediately taking charge of the airway while Julia prepped the surgical tools. She could hear the quick, controlled movements of Samuel behind her, the way he efficiently worked, but her focus remained on the patient in front of her. It was what she did best, saving lives, taking charge, and blocking out everything else. In this moment, there was no room for distractions. Not even the growing attraction she felt toward Samuel. As the hours passed, the trauma cases piled in, and the earth felt like it was about to burst at the seams. Julia and Samuel worked tirelessly, side by side, with little time to acknowledge the tension that simmered beneath the surface. Every now and then, their eyes would meet across a room, but the connection was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the urgency of the situation. Eventually, the chaos began to subside. Julia was covered in blood and sweat, but the adrenaline had worn off, leaving a sense of exhaustion that seeped deep into her bones. She wiped her brow and looked around, only to find that Samuel was still by her side, his face as determined as ever. "We've got another one coming in," Samuel said, glancing at the chart in his hand. "A gunshot wound. The paramedics are bringing her in," Julia sighed, feeling the weight of the night's work pressing on her. She had barely enough time to think before the next challenge arrived, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. "Not now." "All right, let's take care of it," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. "I'll prep the OR. You handle the initial assessment." Samuel nodded and walked away without another word, but there was something in his step that made Julia's pulse quicken again. It was subtle, but she noticed the way his movements were deliberate, purposeful. The way he was always close but never too close. Before Julia could follow him, she was approached by one of the senior nurses, Laura. Laura was a longtime member of the team, and her concern for Julia was obvious. "You've been pushing yourself too hard, Julia," Laura said, her tone soft but concerned. "You need to take a break. There's no shame in that." Julia waved off the concern, knowing Laura meant well. "I'm fine, just tired, that's all. The patients need me." Laura shook her head, her eyes narrowing in skepticism. "You're human, Julia. You can't keep going like this." Julia didn't respond, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Laura was right. She hadn't been getting enough sleep, hadn't been eating properly, and she was barely keeping her emotions in check. And then there was Samuel. Always there, always close, his presence a constant reminder of how vulnerable she had become to the very thing she had sworn off: distraction. As Julia prepped for the gunshot wound patient, her thoughts kept drifting back to him. She tried to push them away, but they lingered. Was she really willing to let something as complicated as a relationship interfere with her career? She had worked too hard to get to where she was, and she wasn't about to jeopardize everything for a fleeting attraction. But that wasn't all it was it? The question lingered in her mind like an unanswered prayer. What was it about Samuel that drew her in? He was confident, calm, and undeniably talented. But it was more than that. There was something in the way he listened to her, the way he respected her, that made her feel seen. It was the kind of attention she had never gotten from anyone else. It wasn't just physical attraction. It was an emotional connection that Julia wasn't ready to confront. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the crash of the doors opening, signaling the arrival of the next trauma patient. She snapped back to reality, her mind clearing as the patient was wheeled in. A young woman in her late 20s was brought in on a stretcher, her face pale and covered in blood. A gunshot wound to the abdomen. Julia felt her pulse race as she assessed the severity of the injury. She immediately began giving orders to her team, her voice firm and clear, focusing entirely on the patient in front of her. "Get a blood transfusion ready. We need to stabilize her fast," Julia commanded. "Start an IV, 2 liters of saline. We need to get her into surgery ASAP." As they worked quickly to stabilize the woman, Julia found herself back in her element. The world around her faded as she focused solely on saving the life of her patient. Samuel was beside her again, his calm demeanor reassuring as they worked together seamlessly, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. "Julia," Samuel said quietly as he assisted her with the intubation, "you're doing great. We're going to get her through this." Julia met his gaze, her breath catching in her throat. She could see the genuine concern in his eyes. For a moment, everything else faded, the exhaustion, the unspoken tension between them, the doubts that had been plaguing her mind. It was just the two of them, working in sync to save a life. And in that moment, something in Julia shifted. The walls she had carefully built around her heart began to crack, just a little. The air was thick in the hospital, heavier than it had been the last few days. Julia stood outside the operating room, her heart hammering in her chest. She had just finished another round of surgery, the third in as many hours. Despite the overwhelming fatigue, she felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. But it wasn't the patients or the surgeries that were on her mind. It was Samuel. She had spent the past few days avoiding him, throwing herself into her work as a means of distraction. But the truth was inescapable, she couldn't stop thinking about him. It wasn't just his smile, his calm presence, or his undeniable skill. It was something deeper, something that made her feel as if she had crossed a line she never meant to cross. Tonight, however, things had changed. Julia glanced down at her watch. It was nearly 10 p.m. She knew Samuel would be finishing up his shift soon. For a moment, she hesitated. Was this what she wanted? To confront the feelings she had tried to bury. She had built a career around being the best surgeon, not being distracted by feelings that could compromise her professionalism. But the truth had already slipped into her life like an uninvited guest, and there was no ignoring it any longer. Before she could gather her thoughts, the sound of footsteps broke her reverie. Julia turned to see Samuel walking toward her, his usual composed demeanor in place, but there was something different in his eyes. There was a question there, something unspoken between them that neither of them had addressed. "Julia," Samuel said quietly, his voice warm but tinged with an edge of concern. "We need to talk." Her heart skipped. She knew this was coming. There was no avoiding it any longer. "About what?" Julia asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though she could feel the tension in the pit of her stomach. He stopped in front of her, his gaze locking with hers. "About us." The words hung in the air like a promise, like an unsung melody that had been building for days, and now it was finally reaching its crescendo. Julia opened her mouth to respond but found that no words came. She had spent so many hours in the OR, saving lives and managing crises, but she wasn't prepared for this. This wasn't something she could control. "I know we've been dancing around this," Samuel continued, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. But I can't keep pretending that I'm not falling for you. I can't ignore how I feel when I'm around you. Julia's breath caught in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to shut it down, to remind him of the professional boundaries they had to maintain. But the words didn't come. Instead, she found herself stepping closer to him, drawn in by the very thing she had tried to avoid. I've tried to focus on my work, Julia murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I've tried to ignore this, but it's hard. So damn hard. Samuel's hand reached out, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest of moments. It was a simple touch, but it sent a shockwave through Julia's body, igniting something she had kept dormant for so long. I know, Samuel said softly, his face inches from hers. I get it, but I can't help how I feel, Julia, and I don't want to hide it anymore. Julia closed her eyes, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She had spent so much time building walls around herself, keeping her heart locked away from anything that might distract her. But here, in this moment, with Samuel standing in front of her, she realized that those walls had crumbled. The very thing she had feared was happening. She was falling for him. Do you want this? Samuel asked gently, his voice filled with an earnestness that made Julia's heart ache. Because I do. Julia opened her eyes and met his gaze, seeing the sincerity there, the honesty. For the first time in days, she let go of her fears and doubts. She had been running from this connection, but she didn't want to anymore. Not when the pull between them was this strong. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I want this too. Before she could say another word, Samuel closed the distance between them, his lips pressing softly against hers. It was a kiss full of promise, full of the raw emotion they had both been hiding. And in that kiss, Julia felt a weight lift from her chest, as if the burden of her own resistance had finally been released. When they finally broke apart, Julia rested her forehead against his, her breath coming in ragged gasps. We'll figure this out, she said, her voice still shaky. We'll take it slow, okay? We don't have to rush into anything. Samuel smiled, his hands gently cupping her face. We'll take it one step at a time, Julia. Together. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Julia allowed herself to believe that there could be more than just her career. She could have both, her passion for medicine and the possibility of love. With Samuel by her side, she didn't have to choose.